Thanks you at home for joining us this hour. Happy Monday. And no, this is not a rerun, but you are going to have a little sense of deja vu because the president's campaign chairman is due to be sentenced by a federal judge again this week. And I know that sounds like last week's news, but this week's sentencing on Wednesday is going to be in addition to the sentencing that Paul Manafort went through with a federal judge in Virginia last week. So those headlines from a distance, they're going to look similar. Before we get to the sentencing on Wednesday, it all sort of feels a little bit similar, but this is going to be a pretty different process this week because this judge in D.C., who's going to be considering Manafort's fate this week and handing him down his new sentence on Wednesday, this is the judge who's going to be considering not the guilty pleas from a jury trial like that Virginia judge was considering last week. No, this judge in D.C. is considering something very different. She's going to be considering the failed plea deal that Paul Manafort got himself into when he tried and failed to become a cooperating witness in an effort to try to get himself a more lenient sentence. You remember how this all went down, right? Manafort went on trial in Virginia. He was convicted on 8 felonies. The jury was hung on 10 others. Manafort had been due for a second federal trial in the neighboring jurisdiction of Washington, D.C. It was on the eve of that second federal trial when Manafort instead jumped, tried this new course. He abandoned his not guilty plea. He said he no longer wanted to go to trial. He started talking to prosecutors. Prosecutors agreed to drop all charges against him in D.C. except for 2 felony conspiracy counts. In exchange, they got not only his pleading guilty, they got him to admit admit that he was guilty even to the 10 felony charges on which he'd had the hung jury in his first federal trial in Virginia. And most importantly, he pledged to cooperate with prosecutors in the special counsel's office. That was the deal Manafort tried to make to save his own skin on the eve of what would have been his second federal trial. And that is what blew up when prosecutors came back to that judge in D.C., to Judge Amy Berman Jackson, and they told her, hey, judge, don't think of this guy as a cooperator. Do not give him any credit for accepting responsibility for his crimes, for providing meaningful assistance to prosecutors. He's not doing that. Prosecutors came back to the judge after she'd approved this plea deal. And the prosecutors told her, it's off. Manafort has lied to us multiple times on multiple subjects. He can't do that under the terms of this deal. This week is now when we're going to see that all come due. This federal judge who's going to sentence Manafort this week on Wednesday, she's the judge who took Manafort's guilty pleadings. She's the one who signed off on the plea agreement he made with prosecutors. She's the one who then ruled from the bench that he broke that agreement because, yes, she ruled in court. He did intentionally lie to prosecutors on multiple occasions on material matters. Incidentally, I should tell you, this is also the same judge who put Manafort in jail in the first place. Last June, this was the judge that ruled he had violated his bail conditions by tampering with witnesses while he was out on bail awaiting trial. That order from Amy Berman Jackson in D.C. is what put Paul Manafort into a federal cell as of last June, where he has been ever since. Now, we know, thanks to last week's sentence, that he isn't getting out of prison for at least a few more years. But this week, we're about to find out just how many years he will have to serve in total, depending on what Judge Jackson gives him on Wednesday. And now, as we head toward that Wednesday ruling, that Wednesday sentencing with that judge, a funny thing is now developing here ahead of the sentencing this week. And it is about Manafort lying to prosecutors and breaching his plea deal and not cooperating. Last year, a reporter at CNBC named Christina Wilkie sort of pulled a rabbit out of a hat. She pulled off a neat trick. The McClatchy News Service had reported last spring that Mueller's office, special counsel's office, had started looking into the Trump organization's previous business dealings and attempted business deals and business trips to the former Soviet Union. So not just Russia, but also places like Georgia and Kazakhstan, dating back into, the 90s and maybe even beyond. In the wake of that reporting from McClatchy, CNBC got a tip about somebody who had played an important role in multiple Trump building efforts in that part of the world. The tip was that in Georgia and in Kazakhstan and in Russia, the Trump Organization, basically the way they'd approach these things is that they'd pitch these big Trump-branded building projects with what amounted to a three-pronged approach. One of those prongs was Trump himself. They'd bring Trump over there himself to get lots of press attention and do events with celebrities and dignitaries and talk up whatever it was they were doing. So they bring the Trump star power. Then they would also bring Michael Cohen, the president's personal lawyer, to make connections and talk terms. But then they would also bring an architect who would show off possible designs for these potential Trump developments. That was basically their three-pronged approach to making these business pitches overseas in the former Soviet Union. So we know what happened to Donald Trump. He became president. We know what happened to Michael Cohen. He's going to prison. What about the other guy? The architect who helped make these pitches for the Trump Organization, he himself has never been accused of any wrongdoing that we know about. Nobody has ever even alleged that he has done anything to get himself in trouble with any of this stuff. But he was proximate to something that is reportedly of investigation, and where the other people involved in it are very, very much at the center of ongoing investigations. So if the Mueller investigation had now started to investigate this part of Trump's business past, well, what about this other guy? I mean, the architect who was involved in all these pitches, is he now part of the investigation too? So Christina Wilkie, reporter at CNBC, reached out to that architect. She got this tip that he was the architect who was involved in those projects. Those projects are now subject of interest to Robert Mueller. She reaches out to the architect. And that is when she pulled that rabbit out of the hat. This reportorial magic trick. I mean, she didn't saw the guy in half, but it's the journalistic equivalent of that. Quote, the architect did not respond to a call or an email, but 8 hours later, meaning 8 hours after we called and emailed him, he announced on Twitter that he was closing his architecture firm after 10 years in business. A few days later, he closed down the Twitter account that he had used to announce that he was closing down his architecture firm. By the end of the week, all the content from his professional website, including his entire international architecture portfolio, had been removed from the web entirely. Also gone was any reference to the two overseas branches of his architectural firm that he had opened in Georgia and in Ukraine. Wow, one call from a CNBC reporter does that. I mean, I'm used to getting no commented. I have been no commented up the yin yang. But I mean, this is no comment, and also I no longer exist. Right? Like, I live for that. Anyway, that really was something. And at the time, you might remember us talking about this on the show. At the time, we actually had that reporter from CNBC, Christina Wilkie, here on the show to try to figure out what had happened there, and she was sort of as bewildered as we were by it. Joining us now is Christina Wilkie, White House reporter for CNBC.com. She's the one who spooked the architect. Christina, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Do you have this effect on people more broadly?
I do not. People love to call me back.
So that was last year in June. And it's interesting, about 6 weeks later-ish, the architect in question did resurface, but without his firm. He put up a statement on his website announcing, quote, this most recent transitional phase of my career, but insisting, I think with annoyance about the kind of press coverage he'd had over it, insisting that he had neither vanished nor disappeared. Honestly, though, his firm did disappear. It did poof. And now that same reporter at CNBC, Christina Wilkie, she does appear to have done it again. And this time it concerns one of the things that Paul Manafort lied to prosecutors about. This judge in D.C. that's going to sentence Paul Manafort this week, she ruled that Manafort deliberately lied to prosecutors on 3 different subjects. And of them, the one that I at least found hardest to follow because of all the redactions in the court documents, it seemed to be about something related to a payment Manafort received in June 2017. So June 2017, this is after Trump's been in office for half a year. It's before Manafort gets indicted, but that was at a time when it was becoming very clear that Manafort was clearly the subject of multiple serious criminal investigations. His legal bills were starting to mount, and in June 2017, Manafort apparently reached out to a pro-Trump super PAC to try to get from them some money to pay his mounting legal bills. Specifically, he asked for $125 grand. Now, the PAC ultimately did not send that money for Paul Manafort's legal defense, but Christina Wilkie at CNBC now appears to have figured out what happened next. As have the special counsel's office, who have been pursuing the case against Manafort in 2 federal courtrooms and who specifically have litigated this point with the judge about why Paul Manafort lied about this payment. So the PAC that Manafort approached to pay his legal bills, that was the biggest pro-Trump super PAC in the whole 2016 campaign. Remember when Trump said he was going to finance his whole campaign and wouldn't need to take in donations from anybody? Ha! This pro-Trump super PAC was the biggest one. It took in over $24 million in donations. Again, not as part of the campaign, but as a pro-Trump super PAC. It was the biggest one. That PAC was run by a very close associate of Paul Manafort. Manafort himself basically set up that PAC as soon as he became Trump's campaign chair. He greenlit the creation of the super PAC, and he installed as the head of it a guy who he had done tons of work with before, a guy who is a long-standing work colleague of Manafort's, dating back decades. He is reportedly godfather to one of Paul Manafort's daughters. What CNBC is now reporting, and what Mueller's office appears to have figured out a while ago, is that when Manafort, in June 2017, asked this pro-Trump super PAC, right, so this is after the campaign, right? Campaign's been over, Trump's already president for half a year. Manafort goes to this pro-Trump super PAC to ask for the money. It's run by his good friend. He wants money to pay some of his legal bills. He asked for $125,000. We now can tell, basically, that the answer from the PAC to Paul Manafort was, yes, but. Yes, Paul, you can have the money, but you're not going to get it from me exactly. Instead, you should get it from this other place, this other entity, this easy-to-forget, generic-named, fuzzy little corporate entity, which, according to CNBC, was secretly owned and controlled by a famous Republican pollster named Tony Fabrizio. And in fact, that little corporate fuzzy entity, MMSC, run by Tony Fabrizio, that's who gave Manafort the money. Now, do you care about Paul Manafort getting some of his legal fees paid for by this Republican pollster guy? Do you care? No, you do not care. I mean, not in the abstract. None of us care about this. But there's 3 sort of like hair-raising consequences of this little revelation. Number 1, why would Paul Manafort lie about that? Over and over and over again, 2 prosecutors, when he was legally bound not to lie to them about anything, and when the question of the freedom of the rest of his life is potentially on the line if he does lie. I mean, he's doing a plea deal, which means he has to cooperate and he can't lie. With the plea deal, he can maybe get out of going to prison for the rest of his life. With no plea deal, it's going to be some years at least. I mean, prosecutors say that Paul Manafort, in those circumstances, not only lied about that $125,000 payment, he told 3 different false stories about that payment in 3 different meetings with the prosecutors from the special counsel's office. I mean, put yourself in his shoes here for a second. I mean, okay. First instance, he comes up with 1 false story about that payment. Okay, maybe, you misremembered, you got it jumbled up. But then the prosecutors come back and ask you about it again. That might be a signal that maybe you screwed up the first time and you ought to make sure you get it right now, since you are legally bound not to lie to them. But then you lie to them again. Different lie. You tell them another false story that's different than the first one, but that is also a lie. Then they come back to you a 3rd time. Hey, we want to talk to you about that payment again. Are you sure? And the 3rd time, you try to snow them with another false story about it. 3 different meetings with the prosecutor specifically on that payment. 3 different lies. He tells a new lie every time. Dude, who cares? It's okay for you to take the money from Tony. I mean, really, that wasn't a bad thing. You're going to go to prison for maybe a decade for lying about that? That's an okay thing for you to have done. What is the problem? So that's consequence 1 of this weird lie. Tony Fabrizio sending Manafort $125,000 to help with his legal fees is not a crime, as far as I can tell. Why Manafort would go to such lengths to lie about it when that had such dire consequences for him, it's just absolutely inexplicable. That's consequence 1. Consequence 2, despite Manafort inexplicably lying about it over and over again, the prosecutors, the special counsel's office, they know the truth. They know what actually happened. From court filings and from open source reporting, it appears that part of the reason Mueller's office knows what really happened here is because they have spoken repeatedly with Tony, with the pollster guy who actually did pay Paul Manafort this money while Paul Manafort lied to them about it over and over again. It appears that in the course of figuring out the truth of that payment, Mueller's office also uncovered a little bit of a kickback scheme. A not particularly sophisticated system by which these guys were basically skimming off a bunch of money that people had donated to the pro-Trump super PAC and instead keeping it for themselves. So they discover the truth of the payment. They also discover, when getting to the truth of the payment, that there was a little bit of a scheme here. There was a kickback scheme here going on. There was cash moving necessarily maybe where it shouldn't have gone. But it's hard to tell this stuff directly from court filings in the Manafort case because of all the redactions and the written documents and in the transcripts. But through basically doing the math and playing that Husker Du game where you try to pair like objects with one another, and through reading closely all these documents and reporting it out and calling people and tracking them down, Christina Wilkie at CNBC appears to have basically figured out a way to get behind all those black boxes in the redacted transcripts so we can actually understand what's going on here. And so it appears what Mueller's office has found and demonstrated to the court, and CNBC can now describe publicly for the first time. It appears that, yeah, Manafort got this payment from Tony Fabrizio, the pollster. It also appears that the longtime Manafort friend, who Paul Manafort installed as the head of that super PAC, that guy and Tony Fabrizio, the other longtime Paul Manafort friend, who Manafort hired to be the Trump campaign pollster, it also appears that those two guys set up some sort of scheme where the two of them took a 6% cash cut of every dollar that Trump's super PAC spent on political ads in the 2016 campaign. And again, the pollster, this famous Republican pollster who appears to be caught up in this stuff, Tony Fabrizio, he has reportedly been talking to Mueller's investigators for a long time now. More than a year ago, February 2018, CNN reported that Fabrizio was seen leaving the special counsel's office. CNN later confirmed that Fabrizio had met with Mueller's prosecutors. Wilkie at CNBC now reports that Fabrizio appears to have done at least one more interview with Mueller many months later in November 2018. So whatever was going on with Tony Fabrizio's side of it, presumably that is all known to the special counsel's office. He's had multiple meetings with them. Fabrizio, for what it's worth, has also been the subject of a detailed document request from the House Judiciary Committee, which I think he has to respond to by next week. But there's one more consequence of this new reporting. Which is that Christina Wilkie appears to have pulled off the same magic trick yet again. The one she did with the architect before, it seems like she's done it again this time. In addition to reporting out the role of Tony Fabrizio here, the other player in this new drama is the guy who Manafort installed to run this super PAC, right? This guy who was apparently part of this cash kickback scheme, who was apparently part of this whole mysterious $125,000 payment that Manafort is going to die on a hill lying about. I mean, the three players in this drama are Paul Manafort, Tony Fabrizio, the Trump campaign pollster, and this other guy who Manafort put in charge of the PAC, the guy who's the godfather to one of Manafort's daughters, his longtime friend. He's apparently somebody who worked together with Manafort all the way back in the 80s. He worked at that lobbying firm that Paul Manafort had with Roger Stone. In addition to Manafort installing him as the head of this pro-Trump super PAC, where there was this kickback scheme running and who knows what else, this guy also ended up playing a key role in the Trump inaugural. Randomly, he was the guy who got put in charge of ticketing all the Trump inaugural events, even though he appears to have had no experience with that sort of thing whatsoever. Okay, so he's of interest. What about him? What about his role in all of this? This guy is a guy named Lawrence Gay. He appears to be, at this point, basically the beleaguered stoplight at the center of a five-way intersection of Trump-related scandals and criminal investigations. How does Lawrence Gay fit into this investigation now? Is he, too, talking to prosecutors? I mean, if Fabrizio has been talking to prosecutors, for example, about his role in this skimming kickback thing and how it connected to getting the cash to Manafort, okay. We know about Manafort's conversation with prosecutors and the problems there. We know this reporting about Fabrizio's conversations with prosecutors. Well, has Lawrence Gay told his side of that story, too? How does he fit into all of this? How does he fit into the special counsel's investigation? How does he fit into the inaugural investigation? How does he fit into the congressional investigation? Cue Christina Wilkie at CNBC and her amazing magical journalistic powers. Quote, CNBC attempted to reach Lawrence Gay several times, but the phone at his Canaan, Connecticut consulting firm, Business Strategies and Insight, has been disconnected. Hello? Hello? I mean, this is not a fly-by-night guy who nobody had ever heard of before, right? This guy had been in the Paul Manafort universe for 40 years. One call from CNBC about this and poof, he's gone, disconnected. Joining us now is Christina Wilkie, White House reporter for CNBC.com. Christina, I know I've been embarrassing you. Thank you very much for being here.
It's such a great pleasure, Rachel.
You seem to have this ability to make people disappear, disconnect their phones, shut down their businesses, and eliminate themselves from social media whenever you ask them questions. I know that there's a lot of different components here, but I have to ask you about that aspect of this story. That must have been a surprise, not to just get no commented by Lawrence Gay, but to have him sort of disappear.
I mean, there's no way to tell necessarily when his phone was disconnected, but it's, in this day and age, yeah, it's unusual to get that really intense beep, 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 beep of a disconnected phone. And, this number's no longer in service.
In terms of Lawrence Gay and this super PAC, it seems like, I mean, I can imagine the things you wanted to ask him about, given what you were able to report about his role here, but it seems like what you're describing is not just that you figured something out, but you believe that Mueller has figured out something about both the routing of that payment to Paul Manafort, but also what appears to have been a cash kickback scheme that was running in the biggest pro-Trump super PAC, right?
Yes, that is what appears to have happened. And yeah, I mean, we have figured out that Lawrence Gay was, that Paul Manafort kind of installed this guy who he really trusted and, to oversee $24 million that Manafort then suggested to Gay that he hire Tony Fabrizio's ad buying firm, this very, no-name multimedia services. And then it appears like the two of them, Fabrizio and Gay, set up their, one man's kickback scheme is another man's commission split. But, so they set up a secret commission split and essentially overcharged all these donors. And, we heard from Lawrence Gay's lawyer, and he says his client has done nothing wrong. He's a criminal defense attorney. So we will see. Gay's voice is very absent from these court documents, whereas there are often obvious references to Manafort interviews and obvious references to Tony Fabrizio's role and what he told prosecutors. Fabrizio is really the kind of truth teller in this, as Manafort tells all these different stories. Fabrizio lays it out, but the third man is really absent. And obviously that's not an accident.
Christina, let me ask you also about that dynamic you just described, where Fabrizio, as far as we know, has spoken with Mueller's office at least a couple of times. He's described in court filings, I think we can now sort of see it the way you've given us this window behind the redactions. We can now see him being described in court filings as the person who gave prosecutors what they believe to be true and corroborated information about that payment to Paul Manafort, while Manafort himself was lying about it over and over again. Do you have any sense now about why Manafort might have been lying about that over and over again? His lawyers really described it as, he got mixed up, he got confused, he didn't remember the precise nature of it. But the prosecutors have documented that he told 3 different false stories on 3 different occasions as their questioning on it escalated.
And if he was, in fact, trying to conceal an illegal kickback scheme, then it would make sense that that's why he told these different stories. At first, he said it was a debt owed to him by Gay. Then he said it was payment for services rendered for business he had sent Fabrizio over the years. And then his third story was that it was a loan from Fabrizio, and he produced an unsigned loan document. And each time prosecutors came back to him and said to him, well, this doesn't quite add up. It doesn't look like Lawrence Gay paid this, because our records show that this no-name advertising firm in Alexandria paid it. And so Manafort came up with another story. There certainly appear to be real questions about the legality of some of what appears to have happened. And Manafort may be protecting his friends.
Wow. And it may be at at great cost. We will find out that in detail on Wednesday at his sentencing. Christina Wilkie, White House reporter for CNBC.com. Careful with who you call. You have a habit of disappearing people, but we'll follow your reporting wherever it leads. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Rachel.
All right, much more ahead tonight. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.